and the number of people converting dropped. But obviously all of those who did were paying customers, and it had a massive effect. I think it increased their profit like 20% overnight.
Hello and welcome to another coffee break episode on the Conversion Podcast, where we provide easy to digest and easily to apply insights on digital experimentation, conversion optimization, and customer experience in the time it takes to grab a coffee. Thanks again for joining, Stephen. The one that we wanted to tee up was the idea of risk profiles in the context of experimentation. So with that, maybe just diving right in, love for you just to maybe give a little bit of a background of like, what is a risk profile really in the context of when you're running online experiments? How should it be used? Yep. Why is it important? And can dive in from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So we think about risk profiles in the same way that you might do with an investment portfolio. So if someone were investing, they might have some low risk options, some medium, some high risk. And the low risk ones are kind of the more steady investments, I suppose, that would be delivering fairly consistent growth. Whereas the high risk at the opposite end, it might do amazing things or it might turn to dust. And we want to think about that in the same way with experimentation, because the ability to A/B test gives us effectively a safety net. So we think of it as a way to manage risk. When you take that concept and apply it to the different ideas, the different hypotheses that you can run, it really unlocks a whole new way of thinking that can encourage an organization to be a lot more aggressive in their thinking. You can unlock a lot of competitive advantage as well.
Oh, yeah, very cool. I think if I think back myself personally, I feel like I heard you talk about this maybe 6-7 years ago for the first time.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm curious if you take me all the way back to there or even probably before. What was really the challenge that caused you to really start championing the idea that every program should have a risk profile?
Yeah, for sure. So I guess in the early days of experimentation or CRO, as people tended to call it back then, a lot of people were thinking about experimentation in terms of running fairly basic tests like, let's tweak this text, or let's, the classic change the color of the button, or even ones like, what happens if we like add an outline to the button or add a shadow effect? And we were thinking like, this is not what we're doing at the Conversion. Like, we think about experimentation in a different way, and sure, those kind of tests sometimes can have an effect, but we wanted to encourage people to think more creatively about experimentation and to use A/B testing as a way to test out some of their biggest and boldest ideas. So we started to espouse this idea of risk profiles in experimentation, that yes, those smaller, more incremental or iterative ideas have a place, but actually we should be testing far bigger ideas, the things that we would be too nervous to just roll out, just make the change and hope the best. But because we can A/B test it, we can limit the fallout to an extent. And if it works, then we're going to be testing the things that our competitors are scared of trying. And so this is how we can get that competitive advantage.
Okay, nice. Maybe to make it quite tangible, especially if someone's listening right now, what are ways to think about different categories of risks in an experiment?
For sure. So we have a fairly simplistic view, I guess. We talk about low, medium, and high risk experiments. So the low risk ones, these are experiments that are more iterative in approach. So you might be building on a concept that you've already tested and validated previously, but you want to push it a little bit further. And these are ones where the only real risk is if you run the experiment and it doesn't work, it's probably not going to cause too much disruption. So really the only thing that you're risking is the time that it takes to actually build and run the experiment itself. Medium risk experiments, these tend to be a little bit more innovative. So if low risk is you're kind of exploiting something that works, the medium risk is more exploratory. So you're testing out something new, you're trying out new ideas, and you're risking the time it takes to build the experiment. But there's a potential that when you run it, it might have a negative effect. And so there's a small, but still worth noting, small risk that you actually reduce sales or conversions or whatever it is for the period in which you're running the experiment. And then finally, we have what we call the high risk experiments. So if the first two were more iterative and innovative, And the high risk, you could say, would be the disruptive ones. So these are ones where you're testing not only a new idea, but you're trying to expand or challenge the existing way of thinking. So as a kind of quick example, you might be testing out a completely new commercial model, or you might be selling a new product category that you've never sold before. Or in the case of one example that we've spoken about recently, you might be removing a free trial that you've always had or you've always relied on. And so these are kind of quite big, bold steps, and you might be nervous to take them if you couldn't run the A/B test. So again, to kind of talk about the risk for those, you've got the cost of building it, the risk in running it, that it might lower sales. But with the high risk ones, potentially there could be a bigger fallout as well that extends beyond the lifetime of the A/B test itself. So it could there could be a reputational question. It could cause some ripples elsewhere that you need to manage. But it doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. It just means you need to consider that ahead of time.
Very cool. I think this is like a powerful way to kind of forces you to think about all of your experiments in aggregate rather than individual tests.
Yeah.
Have you seen people that applied a risk profile approach actually looking at the overall impact of the program and how it changed? Like, do you have any big wins that you've seen when people have actually tried to roll this out, how it really changed like the direction?
Yeah, absolutely. So often what we see is, in particular, if we're working with a client and they've done some experimentation before, typically they will be towards the lower or medium risk end of the spectrum, as you would expect. And if we start working with them, then it's not like we come in and we say, okay, let's run, 1/3 of our experiments should be high risk, for example. We're not going to come in and do that. But what we look to do is to build up the trust in the approach and in the impact. And then we start to kind of like picking on a little thread, as it were, to say, well, how could we turn that question into an experiment? And sometimes those are the high risk concepts. Like it's really useful to ask open-ended questions like, if you could test anything, what would you do? Or what are the things that you'd love to try that you've been too nervous to do? Or what are your competitors afraid to try that we could consider? Or there's one which is a favorite, which is, what is true in this organization or in this industry that no one's ever really questioned or challenged? Because sometimes people kind of take something for granted, like this works in a certain way. Like, let me give you an actual concrete example of that. The Domino's Pizza here in the UK, I've worked with them for like 5 years or so total. And throughout that time, and for as long as I can remember before that, they always had free delivery. So you'd order your pizza on a Friday night, whatever, and you pay the cost of the pizza, but the delivery is free. But then meanwhile, over the last 5-10 years, we've had the growth of Uber Eats or DoorDash in the US, and Deliveroo and Just Eat and so on, like all of these competitors where typically you're paying for the food, but you're also paying, there might be a service fee, there might be delivery fee, there might be a tip on top, and so on. And so we were working Domino's and we were talking about this, and they were thinking, well, maybe there's a chance that customers expect to pay for delivery now, and we're missing a trick. We're missing out on £3, £4 delivery fee, which would just be pure margin that our customers would typically be happy to pay. So that's the kind of thing that you can run as a test, and we did run as a test with them to see what the impact would be and to measure what the effect is. And that's exactly the perfect high-risk experiment, because it's a really kind of bold idea. It's still backed by evidence. There's a bit of a risk of fallout, but it could be transformational if it's successful.
Nice. Yeah. That's a great example. If someone goes about that they want to actually start using a risk profile or building their own risk profile, how should they go about figuring out what is the right profile for their particular circumstance?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's not really one that you need to overthink. I think the first thing is to be aware of I guess, of the concept of risk profile. So you can start looking at your backlog and thinking, okay, all of these feel like fairly safe bets. Let's try and be a little bit more innovative or a little bit more disruptive, excursive, for example. What we find useful is to actually label experiments in the backlog as low, medium, and high risk experiments. And we've got our own criteria. You can obviously come up with your own, but it's kind of like we were saying a second ago, we're building on something that we've tested before, or we're trying out something new, is there a risk? Is this a kind of truly disruptive experiment? Yeah, come up with approximate labels. Doesn't have to be too precise. There's no kind of wrong answer here. And then like color code the experiments and try and get a feel for like, are we 80% low risk and 20% medium and 0 high risk? And if so, are we happy with that? Because it could be that that's the right thing to do. Like the thing with the same with an investment portfolio is what's right for someone in their 60s is probably not going to be right for someone in their 20s. So a risk strategy can change over time. And often we see that with clients as well, where they might want to take fewer risks during peak season. Like if it's Black Friday or Christmas or something, they might want to kind of dial down the risk and say, let's not try and rock the boat, but let's try and keep our experimentation program ticking along. But in quieter times of the year, they might think, okay, now's the time to test out some of those bolder ideas that we haven't had a chance to before.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's a very cool tool also for planning and getting buy-in and like discussion and kind of getting more people involved, that having discussion about what experiments we should run and levels of risk and the likely size of what the impact will be, I think is a fascinating catalyst inside the organization too. Have you seen anything around that, around how to work it into planning sessions or?
Yeah, I mean, to be direct, I think the hardest bit is the high risk. Like most people, they've normally got the low and the medium risk. So the high risk tends to be the one that you have to push on. But there are a few different ways that we could think about that, or exercises or questions to ask. Like I mentioned previously, in terms of if you could test anything, what would it be? Or what are your competitors too scared to try? But 3 things that we would recommend. One is the idea of invalidating lore, as in LORE, not LAW. So one of the early Facebook people, Chamath Palihapitiya, talked about one of the things that they did to drive this tremendous growth at Facebook was to invalidate all of the lore, LORE, that exists in the organization, like the stuff that people accept as true, even though no one's ever actually questioned it. And so they said, well, okay, let's try that. And so one example would be that SaaS company that I mentioned a second ago, where we tested removing their free trial to see what would happen. This is one where the free trial was actually costing them, the company, money. So for every trial user that signed up, they would have to pay for it, and a relatively low percentage would then convert. So we said, okay, what happened if we remove the free trial altogether, just go straight from visitor to paying subscriber? And the number of people converting dropped, but obviously all of those who did were paying customers, and it had a massive effect. I think it increased their profit like 20% overnight. So that's one where we think about invalidating lore. A second exercise that we'd recommend is this idea of divergent thinking. So where you take something and then you ask the same question again and again and again. And I forget which podcast it was, but Brian Cheska was talking about like the early days of Airbnb, and he was saying, like, he was asking people, like, what's a 5-star experience? Like if you went to an Airbnb and had a 5-star experience, what would that be like? And so, okay, what's a 6-star experience? I'll try and make it a bit better. And then 7 and 8 and 9 and so on. And they kind of kept on going and going and going until it starts to get like super ridiculous and you're being met off the plane by the Beatles or whatever. But that idea of divergent thinking really kind of pushes people to think completely differently. And then you can then start walking it back a little bit to say, okay, well, how much of this can we take? And you can obviously apply the same thing to a website. Like if we know X is true about our customers, how can we leverage that idea as much as possible? So I'll try and give another example. So with one of our clients in the UK, this is a pharmacy chemist company, kind of like a Walgreens in the US. We were working on their digital service where they would dispense prescription medication online. And we could see that there was one lever, as we talked about, that was super impactful for all of their customers. So no matter what we tested, the idea of shipping was always successful. So if we talked about the speed of shipping or the cost, or even like the actual envelope that the medication would come in, all of these tests were successful. So we said, okay, if we know that thing about our customers, the thing that our customers care about is shipping, how can we extend that as much as possible? And they have this company, the client has a large high street presence here in the UK. So we said, well, what if we could offer same day in-store collection? Like, the next best thing to getting things the next day is getting things today. So let's try and offer that. And then rather than actually building that functionality and rolling it out, we said, let's just run it as a painted door test. So we give people the option of same day pickup. And we'll just see if people bite, like how much of an impact is that going to drive? Like, is this going to be something that people will try and take up? And sure enough, it was a runaway success to the point that they actually justified the quite significant tech investment to roll out this functionality and make it work in the stores as well. And it was a super successful experiment. And it started from that one idea of our customers really care about shipping.
It's a thorough list. That's good.
It is. Yeah. The third point, so I talk about this sometimes, which is like, think about experiments in terms of 2x, not 2%.
Yeah.
So, the idea of a minimum detectable effect, which is, if you've got a minimum detectable effect of 10%, then anything below that, it can be hard to detect that impact in an A/B test. So 2x, not 2%. Imagine that the minimum detectable effect is 2x. In other words, 100% increase in the conversion rate is the only thing that you can detect, that or above. And anything lower than that isn't going to be picked up. So the only ideas that you can put forward are ones that stand a chance of doubling the conversion rate. And that changes how people think, because I think there's a risk, like an easy trap to fall into in experimentation, where you kind of think about, well, let's take something and making it a little bit better and then a little bit better. And it kind of becomes very incremental, and, it doesn't always get you too far. Whereas if you stop and think, okay, what would we do if we could only double the conversion rate or nothing? Double or quits. Like, what would we do? That kind of acts as a little bit of a gatekeeper in stopping some of those more incremental ideas, and it forces people to think about the bigger, bolder concepts.
Love the list. That last one also reminds me, actually, I think a very cool kind of connection of like really thinking about the stage or the need, or like even just the context of the company, right? Like if you're in a thing where you need a bold breakthrough, you definitely should be making those bigger bets, but recognizing the trade-off of the likelihood you're going to hit the bet is much lower than your 2% incremental change.
Yeah.
I think that goes really down to like, it depends in terms of like the nuance of, in certain situations, incremental wins are really valuable. They will add up over times. And then I think of, there's like that classic Netflix example where they were trying to get to market, it needed to get off the ground. And like, they were like, we can only do big things. We're not doing anything small at this point. It's really radically different in terms of those two. There's different moments in the company where they had to go big, and other times where it's like they're constantly optimizing with hundreds of experiments running in a certain period.
And I guess you have to think that for most companies, either they're not taking these big bets at all, which is probably a bad idea, or they're taking the big bets, but they're not testing them, or they're not measuring the data, or they're not using experimentation to inform it and to kind of like cheat, as it were, in terms of trying to find out what the answer is going to be before they actually commit to it. And there are the companies who are taking big bets and using experimentation to be that safety net, and you can kind of think like, which of those three companies do I want to be?
Definitely agree. I know this is actually starting to extend into a long episode, so bringing this a little bit tight and making sure we still fit it in a coffee break. Love to just maybe have one final thing of just actionable advice. So if someone's listening right now and they're like, I would like to start applying this, maybe just walk through a couple tangible steps of like, what could they start doing right away to apply this inside of their company or program?
Yeah. So I would start by looking at what is working already. This is a kind of like a bottom-up approach.
Yeah.
So if you look at the experiments that you've run in the last 12 months and the ones that are significant, either positive or negative, the ones where you've got that reading from the customers that this is something that they care about, then take those ideas and start maybe that divergent thinking that we were talking about a second ago, like how do we scale this up and up and up? You can start with something simple, like the example I gave a second ago with the shipping example, and say, well, if people care about this, how could we make it into a 5-star experience, a 6-star, 7-star, 8-star, and so on, and then see like how close can we get to that, or how can we approximate that? So there's that kind of bottom-up approach. Another useful exercise is taking the top-down approach, which is if you're thinking about your company, they might be planning, this is our FY26 strategy. These are the things that we're going to be investing in over the next year, or this is our longer term, like a 3-year plan, like this is what we want to achieve. a really good exercise is looking at that document and saying, okay, these are the 5 things that we as a company are going to be investing in. How can we use experimentation as a way of like having a head start? Or how can we kind of pre-test some of these ideas? Like, okay, we want to launch, we're a furniture company, but we want to start selling carpets. Like, how can we test that as a concept and see, like, is this something our customers would care about? And a bunch of different ways. Like, you could test something within the email newsletter, or you could add something to the website, but keep it relatively limited, or you could find a way to actually, that could either be a real experiment where you're kind of drop shipping those products, or you could just run it as a paint the door experiment, like that pharmacy company I mentioned a second ago. There are a bunch of different ways that you can take what is quite a kind of big ambition and a longer term company strategy and say, okay, what's the tangible test that we can run on that tomorrow? And then if you run that, and then you run the next iteration and the next, then you can create a really compelling package of information that you could go to the CFO, the CEO, or a VP product or whoever with and say, like, here is some of the data and insight that we've been gathering that will help inform the direction that we should go on. And it's a really great way of embedding that experimentation mindset within the culture.
Very cool. And then just my second part to that is, if someone wants to keep digging into this, I do want to maybe emphasize again, I think it's a really powerful tool. Like, are there any resources you recommend? Like, there's probably some conversion stuff, but even outside of conversion, that would be great to dig deeper in terms of where people can continue learning.
We've got a post on our website that's a few years old, but just as relevant. So if you Google conversion risk profile, it should hopefully be the first result. It's not like a super common topic for people to talk about it, but it's an incredibly powerful one for the companies that do harness it.
Very cool. Okay, well, I really thank you for your time. I think it's like a fascinating subject. You can probably dive quite deep in this one. And again, just can't emphasize like more like kind of the power it has in terms of planning, alignment, even just driving like impact. So thank you very much. Everyone listening, thanks for listening in again for another Coffee Break episode. More to come. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye.